Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. My name is Quentin Hayes. I'm 33 years old, and I own a small woodworking studio in Richmond, Virginia. I build custom tables, cabinets, shelving units, and whatever else keeps my hands busy enough to keep my mind clear. By the time I met Rochelle Bennett, I had been running the business for almost 4 years. I was not rich, and I was not pretending to be. I worked long days, paid my bills, helped my mother when she needed something fixed around her house, and spent most weekends either catching up on orders or finding somewhere quiet to eat. Rochelle came into my life through a mutual friend at a birthday dinner. She was 31, worked as an assistant manager at a clothing boutique in Carytown, and had the kind of confidence that made her room seem smaller when she walked into it. She was funny, ambitious, observant, and complicated enough to keep me curious. We exchanged numbers that night. What started as occasional conversations turned into something neither of us ever formally named, but for 4 months, it looked and felt like we were steadily moving toward a relationship. Rochelle called me almost every evening. Sometimes we talked for 20 minutes. Other nights, we stayed on the phone until after midnight. We met for coffee before work, tried new restaurants around Richmond, drove to Virginia Beach one Saturday, simply because she said she had never watched the sunrise there, and spent several Sundays walking around Bird Park with ice cream melting faster than we could eat it. She learned how I took my coffee. I learned that she hated driving in heavy rain and always forgot to charge her phone. When her car spent 3 days in the repair shop, I picked her up before work twice and drove her home afterward because her brother's schedule did not line up with hers. When the curtain rod in her bedroom pulled out of the wall, she called me. When she bought 2 floating shelves and admitted she had no idea how to mount them, she called me. When she had a miserable day at work after losing a sales competition to another location, she called me and asked if I could bring dinner because she did not feel like going anywhere. I did. None of those things felt like burdens because I believed we were building something mutual. Rochelle did things for me too, which was part of why I never viewed her as someone simply taking advantage. She occasionally brought coffee to my workshop. She remembered when I had a difficult client meeting and texted afterward to ask how it went. Once, when I worked through lunch, trying to finish a dining table before a deadline, she arrived with sandwiches and sat on an overturned crate while I ate. There was enough effort from her to make the connection believable, but there was also a pattern I did not fully recognize at first. Whenever I tried to move us toward clarity, Rochelle became vague. If somebody asked whether we were dating, she laughed and said, "Quentin and I are just enjoying each other's company." If I suggested planning something several weeks ahead, she would say she did not like feeling tied down. Yet if I went an entire day without calling, she noticed. If I was unavailable when she needed something, she asked what had suddenly become more important. I kept interpreting those contradictions generously. Rochelle had told me about a serious relationship in her 20s that ended badly, and I understood why commitment might make her cautious. I thought patience would give her space to feel safe. I did not realize she had started treating my patience as proof that I would always remain available. The conversation that finally changed everything happened on a Sunday afternoon at a small ice cream shop beside Bird Park. We had spent the morning walking around Fountain Lake, and Rochelle seemed relaxed until I told her there was something I wanted to discuss. I said, "We've been spending a lot of time together for 4 months. I really like you, Rochelle. I'm not interested in pretending this is casual forever, so I wanted to ask if you'd like to make this official." She stared at her cup for a few seconds before looking at me. Rochelle said, "Quentin, you know I care about you. You have been amazing to me. I just don't think I'm ready to call anybody my boyfriend right now." I asked whether something had changed. She shook her head and said, "Not exactly. I'm trying to focus on getting promoted, and after what happened in my last relationship, I promised myself I wouldn't rush into another commitment. I also feel like I need to see what else is out there before I lock myself into anything serious." That last sentence hurt more than I expected. At least it was clear. I nodded and said, "All right. I appreciate you telling me." Rochelle's expression immediately softened, almost with relief. She smiled and said, "I knew you would understand. That's one of the things I like about you. We don't have to make this weird. We can still text every day, hang out, get dinner, take trips, all of that. Nothing has to change. That was the moment I understood that we had heard the same conversation differently. I said, something does have to change for me. Her smile disappeared. I explained that I could respect her decision without volunteering to stay in exactly the same emotional position. I'm not angry that you don't want a relationship, I told her. But I do want one, and I have feelings for you. Acting like your almost boyfriend while you decide who else you might prefer would not be healthy for me. Rochelle leaned back and asked, so now you're cutting me off because I won't give you a title? I told her no. I was simply stepping away from a situation that no longer matched what I wanted. She called it dramatic. I called it necessary. She tried to soften the conversation before we left. Rochelle said, you're talking like I rejected you forever. I just said I need time. I replied, and I heard you. Take whatever time you need. You don't owe me a relationship. She asked, then why can't we stay the same? I looked at her and said, because staying the same gives you everything you already have while I keep hoping you eventually choose me. That is not friendship, at least not from my side. For the first time that afternoon, she looked genuinely unsettled. I could tell she had expected disappointment, maybe even persuasion, but not withdrawal. I stood, wish her well, and told her I was going back to the workshop for a few hours. Rochelle remained at the table with her ice cream untouched. Driving away, I did not feel powerful. I felt sick. I had invested months in someone I had begun picturing beside me in parts of my future. For several miles, I almost turned around. A part of me wondered whether I had overreacted. Another part knew that if I returned immediately, I would be teaching Rochelle that my boundaries disappeared whenever she became uncomfortable. The next 2 weeks were harder than I admitted to anyone. I had gotten used to waking up to Rochelle's messages, hearing her voice after work, and automatically including her in weekend plans. Several times I picked up my phone because something happened that I knew would make her laugh. Then I remembered our conversation and put it back down. I buried myself in orders instead. I had 2 custom bookcases to finish, a reception desk for a dental office, and 3 smaller projects waiting behind them. Rochelle sent one casual message 3 days after our conversation asking whether I had seen a new restaurant opening downtown. I answered politely, but did not turn it into a conversation. 5 days later, she sent me a photograph of a crooked cabinet door and wrote that it was driving her crazy. I replied with the number of a handyman I trusted. She did not answer. By the second week, the messages stopped. I thought maybe she had accepted that I meant what I said. I later learned that she had interpreted my silence very differently. She had not believed I was leaving. She believed I was creating temporary distance before coming back and trying harder. That became obvious when her new couch arrived. Rochelle called while I was sanding a walnut tabletop. I let it go to voicemail, then listened during a break. She said, "Hey, stranger. My couch finally came, but the delivery guys left it downstairs because they were only paid for curbside delivery. Can you come by tonight and help me get it upstairs? You know I can't move that thing myself." Before a conversation at the park, I probably would have gone without thinking. I had carried boxes into her apartment when she moved, assembled a dresser, hung shelves, changed a flat tire, and once driven across town because her battery died after work. She had gotten used to asking. I texted that I had several workshop orders to finish and suggested she call her brother or pay the delivery company to return and move it. Rochelle responded almost immediately. "Seriously," she wrote. "You have helped me with things like this before." I replied, "I know. Things are different now." She wrote, "So this is punishment?" I answered, "No. It is exactly what I explained to you." I put my phone down and returned to work. What I did not know then was that Rochelle had already begun talking to someone else before a conversation at Bird Park. His name was Bryce Coleman. He was 35 and worked in regional sales for a cosmetics distributor that occasionally supplied events at her boutique. They had met at a promotional launch about 3 weeks before I asked Rochelle to become my girlfriend. Nothing serious had happened yet, but she found him exciting. He traveled frequently, dressed well, seemed connected, and had the kind of outgoing confidence Rochelle loved. She had not technically cheated on me because we were never officially together. The betrayal was something more deliberate. Rochelle had decided she wanted to explore Bryce while keeping me close enough to return to if Bryce disappointed her. I would not learn the full truth until later, but Denise Walker, one of Rochelle's closest friends, knew almost everything. Rochelle had told her, "Quentin is safe. He is not going anywhere. If I call him at midnight, he answers. I just need to know whether there is something stronger out there before I settle." Denise had warned her that people did not remain available simply because she expected them to. Rochelle laughed and said I was too invested to walk away. During the weeks after I stepped back, my own life moved more slowly than Rochelle imagined. I did not meet another woman the next morning and forget 4 months of feelings. I went to work, went home, slept badly, and occasionally wondered whether Rochelle would call and say she had reconsidered. Then a new customer walked into my studio on a Wednesday afternoon. Her name was Amber Ellis. She was 30, worked as a community programs coordinator for a neighborhood art center, and needed 3 mobile display shelves for a weekend makers program. She arrived carrying a folder full of measurements that turned out to be wrong. When I pointed that out, she laughed at herself instead of pretending otherwise. Amber said, "I measured the wall twice and somehow became less accurate the second time." I told her I could stop by the center and take proper measurements. She asked several practical questions about wood, durability, cost, and whether teenagers could damage the shelves by leaning on them. She did not flirt with me. I did not flirt with her. I simply liked how easy the conversation felt. 2 days later, I met Amber at the art center, took measurements, and watched her spend 10 minutes patiently explaining a registration form to an elderly man who was embarrassed because he could not read one section clearly. She never rushed him or made him feel foolish. That stayed with me. After we finished, Amber asked whether I had eaten lunch. I said I would grab something back at the shop. She pointed across the street and said, "That means you are going to forget until 4 o'clock. There's a cafe right there. I am buying because you saved me from ordering 3 shelves that would have been too wide for the doorway." I almost declined out of habit, then went with her. We talked about work, families, terrible apartment furniture, and the difference between being busy and pretending to be busy. Amber told me she had ended a relationship 8 months earlier because the man kept making promises and disappearing whenever responsibility arrived. She was not bitter about it. She simply said, "I realize consistency matters more to me than excitement." That sentence landed harder than she knew. When lunch ended, we exchanged a few more messages about the project. Nothing dramatic happened. But for the first time since Rochelle, I drove back to work thinking about somebody else. Amber's shelves took almost 2 weeks because I had existing orders ahead of hers. During that time, she stopped by twice to approve the stain, and once because she had forgotten a folder in my office. Each conversation stretched longer than necessary. She asked questions about how I started woodworking. I asked about the program she ran. She told me her younger sister was studying nursing in Norfolk and that her father believed every wooden object could be repaired with glue, regardless of what broke. I told her my mother thought owning a woodworking business meant I should be available to repair every cabinet in Richmond for free. Amber laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from the corners of her eyes. I noticed something important in those conversations. I was not performing for her. I did not have to prove I was useful enough to earn another meeting. Amber reached out first sometimes. If I suggested Saturday, she either accepted or offered another day instead of leaving me guessing. When the shelves were delivered, she asked if I wanted to attend the Maker's Market that weekend. She said, "Not as the guy who built the shelves. I mean with me." I understood the distinction. I told her I would like that. Our first real date happened at the Richmond Farmers Market the following Sunday. We bought coffee, argued pleasantly over which bakery had the best cinnamon rolls, and spent 20 minutes at a plant stall because Amber claimed my workshop needed something alive that was not made from lumber. I told her any plant that entered my workshop was accepting personal responsibility for its survival. She picked up a small pot hose and said, "Then start with something difficult to kill." I bought it. We walked through the craft stalls afterward, and for most of the morning, I forgot that I had spent the previous month questioning whether I had walked away from Rochelle too quickly. Amber did not erase what I'd felt. She simply gave me a different experience to compare it with. When she asked about my business, she listened to the answer instead of waiting for her turn to speak. When I told her I could not meet the following Thursday because of a delivery, she said, "No problem. Friday works for me." There was no guilt, no test, and no suggestion that my availability measure my affection. That calm reciprocity was unfamiliar enough that I noticed it. Rochelle noticed it too. Amber and I were standing near the flower stalls when I heard Rochelle's voice behind me. Well, this is interesting. I turned and saw Rochelle with Denise. Rochelle looked from me to Amber and then at the coffee in my hand, as if it were evidence in a trial. She said, "I thought you were too busy with workshop orders to do anything these days." I replied, "I was busy when you asked me to move your couch. Today is Sunday." Rochelle gave a small laugh that had no humor in it. I introduced them. "Amber, this is Rochelle. We know each other from around Carytown. Rochelle, this is Amber." I deliberately kept the introduction neutral. Amber smiled and said, "Nice to meet you. Quentin mentioned that your boutique is close to his studio." Rochelle immediately looked at me. "You mentioned me?" she asked. I said, "Your store came up when we were talking about the neighborhood." That answer seemed to irritate her more than if I had denied it. She looked at Amber's hand resting lightly against my arm, and then asked how long we had known each other. Amber answered before I could. "A few weeks. We met through a project at the art center." Rochelle's eyebrows lifted. "A few weeks," she repeated. "That was quick." Denise quietly said, "Rochelle." Rochelle ignored her. She asked whether we were staying at the market. I said Amber and I were going to lunch. Rochelle immediately said, "Perfect. Denise and I were about to eat too. We can all go together." Amber looked at me, leaving the decision to me instead of speaking for me. I said, "We already planned to have lunch alone." Rochelle stared at me for a moment. "Seriously? You can't have lunch with an old friend because you're on one date?" I replied, "I never said I couldn't. I said we already have plans." Denise stepped closer to Rochelle and murmured that they should leave. Rochelle finally smiled at Amber, but it looked forced. She said, "Enjoy your lunch." Amber thanked her. As we walked away, I glanced back once. Rochelle was still standing in the same place watching us. Amber waited until we were seated before asking, "Were you and Rochelle together?" There was no accusation in her voice. I appreciated that. I said, "Not officially. We spent several months getting close. I want a relationship." She didn't. Amber nodded slowly and asked, "And you still have feelings for her?" That question deserved an honest answer. I told her I was hurt when it ended, so I would be lying if I said everything disappeared immediately. But I'm not trying to use you to make her jealous. If that is what this looks like, I understand if you want distance. Amber studied me for a moment before saying, "It did not look like you were performing for her. You looked uncomfortable." Then she added, "I just don't want to walk into unfinished business." I told her neither did I. We agreed to take things slowly. That conversation made me respect her more because she was not pretending the situation was simple simply because she liked me. She had boundaries of her own. That mattered. It meant I was not exchanging one fantasy for another. We were two adults deciding whether what was growing between us deserved room. Later, Denise told me what happened after Amber and I left, but only because Rochelle eventually dragged her into the conflict. At the market, Rochelle had watched us disappear toward the restaurant and said, "He is doing this because he wants me jealous." Denise told her, "No, I think he's doing exactly what he said he would do. He is moving on." Rochelle insisted I could not have cared much if I was already seeing somebody else. Denise reminded her that I had asked for a relationship, and she had declined. Rochelle said, "I thought he would at least fight for it." Denise asked what that meant. Rochelle finally admitted, "I wanted to know how serious he really was. Bryce was asking me out, and I wanted to see where that went. Quentin is dependable. I figured if Bryce turned out to be nothing, Quentin would still be there." Denise apparently stared at her for several seconds before saying, "You do understand that you just described keeping one man waiting while you tested another one?" Rochelle became defensive. She said it was not like that because I had never complained about helping her before. Denise replied, "That was when he thought you were building towards something together." I knew none of that conversation that day. All I knew was that Rochelle started calling again. I ignored the first call because I was driving Amber home. Rochelle called twice the next evening and once the following afternoon. Then she texted, "We need to talk about what happened at the market." I replied, "There is nothing to discuss." She wrote, "You are being childish." I did not answer. 2 hours later, she wrote, I thought you cared about me more than this. That sentence got under my skin because part of me still did care. I started typing a response, deleted it, typed another, then deleted that too. Finally, I blocked her number. It was not a triumphant decision. My hand actually hovered over the screen before I confirmed it. I kept remembering road trips, late phone calls, the dinner she brought to my shop, and the version of our connection I had believed was becoming serious. But every new conversation with Rochelle pulled me back into defending a boundary I had already explained. I realized that if I kept leaving the door open simply because I cared, she would keep treating the opening as an invitation. 3 nights later, Rochelle showed up outside my apartment shortly after 9. I had just returned from the workshop and was carrying a bag of groceries when I saw her standing near the entrance. I stopped several feet away and asked what she was doing there. Rochelle said, You blocked me. I answered yes. She looked genuinely stunned that I admitted it without argument. I called you 3 times yesterday, she said. I know. She asked how I could be so casual after everything we had shared. I told her I was not casual about it. I was tired. Rochelle crossed her arms and said, You spent 4 months telling me you cared about me. You bought me things, drove me places, helped me whenever I needed something, and now, because I asked for a little time, you're treating me like I never mattered. I corrected her. You did not ask me to wait while you figured out whether you wanted a relationship with me. You told me you wanted to keep your options open. I respected that. She said, You knew what I meant. I replied, I knew exactly what you said. Rochelle's frustration finally pushed her past the version of events she had been trying to maintain. She said, I thought if you were serious, you would keep trying. I did not answer immediately. She continued, I thought you would show me that I mattered enough for you to fight for this instead of disappearing the first time I did not give you exactly what you wanted. I asked, Fight against what? She looked away. I asked again, Rochelle, who was I supposed to be competing with? Her face changed. That was when I knew there had been somebody else. I said, There was another man. She sighed and admitted there was someone named Bryce she had been talking to. She quickly added that they were not serious when we had our conversation. I said, So while I was asking you to build something with me, you were wondering whether Bryce might be a better choice. Rochelle said, I was trying to make the right decision for myself. I told her she had every right to do that. Then I asked why she expected me to continue acting like her boyfriend while she compared me with somebody else. Rochelle became quiet. Then she said something that changed how I remember the previous 4 months. Because I knew you would be there. She must have realized how it sounded because she immediately tried to explain. She said, I do not mean that in a bad way. You were dependable. You always answered. You always showed up. I thought what we had was strong enough that I could take time to be sure. I asked, Be sure I was better than Bryce? She said, That is not fair. I replied, It is exactly what you are describing. She admitted she had expected me to keep calling, keep checking on her, and maybe even become jealous enough to prove I wanted her. She said, I thought you would chase a little harder. That hurt more than the original rejection. I could have accepted that she did not love me. I could have accepted that she wanted somebody else. What I struggled to accept was realizing that she had knowingly turned my feelings into a test without telling me there was a test. She had placed me in a competition, then expected me to remain useful while she judged the results. I said, You had every right to choose somebody else. You did not have the right to expect me to stay emotionally parked in the same place until you decided whether I was good enough. Rochelle said, I never said you were not good enough. I replied, You did not have to. You wanted to explore Bryce while keeping me close enough to return to. That tells me what position I had. She started crying, which made the conversation harder, not easier. I did not enjoy seeing her hurt. She asked if I had really moved on with Amber already. I said Amber and I were getting to know each other and that I intended to respect that. Rochelle said, You barely know her. I answered, That is true, which is why we were taking our time. She asked what Amber had that she did not. I told her, This is not about comparing you two. That is the exact kind of competition I refuse to participate in. Rochelle wiped her face and said she only wanted us to go back to normal. I told her normal was me giving relationship-level effort while you kept the relationship optional. I cannot go back to that. Rochelle asked if we could go inside and talk longer. I told her no. She looked offended and asked why I was treating her like a stranger. I said, because you showed up uninvited after I blocked your number. I am standing here because I want to end this respectfully, but I am not inviting you upstairs. She stared at the ground for several seconds. Then she said, so that is it? You're throwing away everything because I made one mistake. I told her no. I am accepting the choice you made. Love is not an audition, Rochelle. I'm not going to compete for a position with someone who already knew me, accepted everything I gave, and still wanted to keep me available while looking for something she thought might be better. She whispered that I was making her sound cruel. I said, I do not think you planned to hurt me. I think you assumed I would wait. That assumption is the problem. She asked whether I hated her. I said I did not. I wished her well and asked her to drive home safely. For once, she did not have another argument. The next month was quieter. Amber and I continued seeing each other, but we did not rush into a relationship simply because Rochelle had left an empty space. Some weeks we met twice. Other weeks are schedules only. Allowed one dinner. Amber came to my studio one Saturday and tried sanding a scrap piece of oak. She lasted 9 minutes before declaring that woodworking was a beautiful profession best admired from a safe distance. I went with her to a fundraising event at the art center and spent half the night stacking chairs because I did not know anybody. We disagreed about small things too. Amber liked making plans early. I tended to decide at the last minute. Once she told me that my habit of answering work calls during dinner made her feel like she was competing with my business. Instead of becoming defensive, I apologized and started putting my phone on silent unless I was expecting something urgent. She was not perfect, and neither was I. What felt different was that problems did not become tests. She told me what bothered her. I listened. When something bothered me, I said it. Mutual effort turned out to be far less dramatic than uncertainty, but far more peaceful. Rochelle's situation with Bryce moved in the opposite direction. I learned the details from Rochelle herself later, not through gossip. Bryce had taken her to several dinners and invited her to 2 events connected to his work. He was charming and attentive when they were together, but inconsistent between dates. Rochelle initially interpreted that as confidence. She liked that he seemed difficult to impress. The more distant he became, the more she chased clarity. Eventually, she asked where their connection was going. Bryce told her he enjoyed spending time with her, but had never been looking for a serious relationship. He traveled too much, was dating casually, and had no intention of becoming exclusive. Rochelle apparently argued that his behavior had made her believe otherwise. Bryce apologized if she misunderstood, but his answer did not change. 2 weeks later, she saw him at an event with another woman he had been dating. There was no dramatic public humiliation. No secret wife appeared. He had simply valued their connection less seriously than Rochelle had hoped. The irony was painful enough without anybody engineering it. That was when Rochelle tried to return to the version of me she remembered. She emailed first because her number was still blocked. The message was short. She wrote that she had been going through something difficult and asked whether we could talk like we used to. I read it twice. Months earlier, I would have dropped whatever I was doing and asked what happened. That night, I closed my laptop and went back to finishing a cabinet door. The next morning, I replied that I hoped she was all right, but that I was not comfortable becoming her emotional support again. Rochelle answered that she was not asking for anything romantic. She simply needed someone who understood her. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny about it. That sentence captured the entire problem. When Rochelle wanted freedom, I was expected to respect distance. When freedom disappointed her, I was expected to provide closeness. I wrote back, I am sorry you are having a difficult time, but I'm not the right person to help you through it. She did not answer for 3 days. Then she asked whether Amber was the reason. I told her no. My boundary existed before Amber. A week later, Denise came by my studio to pick up a small side table she had ordered months earlier. She looked uncomfortable when she mentioned Rochelle. I told her she did not need to explain anything. Denise said, I know, but she keeps saying you left because you found Amber. That is not what happened. Then she told me about the conversation Rochelle had with her before I ever asked for commitment. Denise had warned Rochelle not to keep me close while exploring Bryce. According to her, Rochelle had replied. Quentin is not going anywhere. He likes me too much. Denise said Rochelle expected that rejecting me would make me pursue her harder, not walk away. Hearing it from somebody else removed the last doubt I had been carrying. Until then, part of me wondered whether I had interpreted Rochelle too harshly because I was hurt. Denise's account matched what Rochelle herself had admitted at my apartment. I thanked Denise, but asked her not to keep updating me on Rochelle's life. I do not need details, I said. I'm trying to move forward. Denise nodded and said she understood. That conversation gave me clarity, but not satisfaction. I did not enjoy being proven right. Amber and I became exclusive about 2 months after our first lunch. I was the one who brought it up, and the difference between that conversation and the one I had with Rochelle was almost startling. We were sitting outside a small restaurant after dinner when I told Amber I was not interested in dating anyone else. She smiled and said, "Good, because I'm getting tired of pretending I have not been hoping you would say that." I laughed and asked why she had not said something earlier. Amber replied, "Because I wanted to know what I wanted before I asked you for anything. There was no demand that I prove myself. No invisible opponent. No expectation that one of us should chase the other through uncertainty. We simply chose each other." A few weeks later, Rochelle saw us again at the Arts Center's fall exhibition. Amber had helped organize it, and I had built several display panels. Rochelle attended with a coworker. When she noticed us, I was standing behind Amber with one hand resting lightly on her shoulder while she laughed at something one of the artists said. Rochelle stopped walking. The look on her face was not anger this time. It was recognition. Later that evening, Rochelle approached me while Amber was speaking with a donor across the room. She did not insult Amber or make a scene. She simply asked, "Are you happy?" I said, "Yes." Rochelle looked toward Amber and nodded. She said, "You look different with her." I asked what she meant. Rochelle replied, "Relaxed. You used to look at me like you were always waiting to figure out where you stood." That was one of the most honest things she had ever said to me. I told her, "I probably was." Rochelle swallowed and said, "I thought the way you cared about me meant I had time. I thought even if I explored something else, you would still be there when I was ready." I said nothing. She continued, "Bryce did not want what I thought he wanted. When that ended, the first person I wanted to call was you. That is when I realized how much I depended on you." I told her dependence was not the same thing as choosing somebody. She nodded. "I know that now," she said. "I did not know it when it mattered." Rochelle asked if we could meet once, somewhere quiet, because she wanted to apologize properly. I hesitated. Amber noticed afterward that I seemed distracted, so I told her exactly what Rochelle had asked. Amber did not tell me what to do. She said, "If you think hearing her out will close something for you, then go. If you think it opens a door you do not want open, do not go." 2 days later, I agreed to meet Rochelle for coffee in the afternoon. It was the first time we had sat across from each other since Bird Park. Rochelle looked nervous. She said, "I owe you an apology," without defending myself. Then she did something I had not expected. She admitted everything plainly. She said she had liked me, but she also liked knowing I was dependable. Bryce seemed more exciting, and instead of choosing honestly, she convinced herself she could explore him without losing me. She admitted telling Denise that I would wait. She admitted expecting me to keep calling and trying harder after she rejected commitment. "I treated your feelings like something I could put on hold," she said. "I thought you would stay where I left you." I appreciated the apology because it sounded different from her earlier attempts. She was not accusing me of moving too fast or blaming Amber. She was finally looking at what she had done. Rochelle said, "I know I cannot undo it, but if there is any possibility of starting over, I want to try. Not the old arrangement. A real relationship. I know what I want now." For one brief moment, I felt the old pull. I remembered why I had liked her in the first place. I remembered our drive to Virginia Beach, the late calls, the sandwiches at my workshop, and the version of us I once thought might become permanent. I would be lying if I said refusing her required no effort. But I also remembered what those months had felt like near the end. I had constantly wondered whether more effort would finally earn certainty. With Amber, I did not have to earn the basic fact that I was wanted. I looked at Rochelle and said, "I forgive you. I mean that. But forgiving you does not mean going back. What happened showed me that we want and understand relationships differently. Rochelle asked whether I was refusing because I loved Amber. I said, Amber matters to me, but my answer would still be no if she were not in the picture. I left before I met her. Rochelle looked down at her hands. I continued, you had every right to choose Bryce or anybody else. What I cannot rebuild is trust with someone who believed she could keep me available while deciding whether another man was better. I do not want to spend a relationship wondering whether I am being chosen or simply retained. She nodded slowly. Then she asked, so there's really nothing I can do? I told her, there is nothing you need to do for me. Learn whatever you want from it and live your life. But I am not returning to that relationship. She whispered, I really did think you would wait. I said, I know. That was the mistake. There was no final argument, no dramatic threat, no promise that I would regret losing her. Rochelle simply sat there with tears in her eyes and accepted an answer she had once assumed she would never have to hear. We walked out of the cafe, separately. I did not feel victorious. I felt finished. That distinction mattered more to me. I did not need Bryce to hurt Rochelle for me. I did not need her to watch Amber and me from across rooms forever. I did not need her to suffer enough to balance some invisible score. The real consequence was simpler. The access she believed would always exist was gone. She had assumed my affection was permanent inventory she could leave on a shelf while shopping for something she considered more exciting. By the time she returned, that shelf was empty because I had finally understood that caring deeply about someone did not require remaining available to them indefinitely. Rochelle eventually stopped emailing. Denise mentioned once that she was doing well and had started spending more time with her family. I told her I was glad and changed the subject. I'm in it. Closure did not require Rochelle to become miserable. It only required both of us to understand that the old arrangement was over. Life with Amber continued in ordinary ways, which became my favorite part of it. She still teased me about the pothose plant she bought at the farmer's market because, against all expectations, it survived. I built her a narrow bookshelf for her apartment, and she insisted on paying for the materials even after I told her it was a gift. On Thursday evenings, she sometimes stopped at the workshop after finishing at the art center, kicked off her shoes near my desk, and read while I finished whatever project had kept me late. Some nights, we barely spoke for an hour. There was no pressure to constantly prove connection. One Saturday, almost a year after Rochelle and I had sat beside Bird Park, Amber and I drove to Virginia Beach before sunrise. I had not been back since the trip with Rochelle. Standing near the water, Amber slipped her hand into mine and complained that I had seriously underestimated how cold the wind would be. I laughed, gave her my jacket, and told her she was the one who insisted sunrise would be romantic. Amber looked at me and said, "It is romantic. I can be romantic and freezing at the same time." Then she leaned against me as the horizon began turning gold. I remember looking at the water and realizing how different peace felt from the uncertainty I had once mistaken for passion. Months earlier, I had spent my time waiting for someone to decide whether I deserved a permanent place in her life. Now I was standing beside someone who had never asked me to audition for hers. Rochelle had believed she could put me aside, test another possibility, and return whenever she wanted the dependable man who answered every call, carried every couch, fixed every shelf, listened to every problem, and stayed ready to prove himself again. She was wrong about one thing. I had cared enough that waiting would have been easy. Walking away was the hard part. But once I did, I discovered that being needed is not the same as being chosen. I tightened my hand around Amber's as the sun came up, and for the first time in a long time, there was nobody behind me I felt tempted to look back for. If you enjoyed the story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification